All right. Well, welcome, Mr. Morrow, to our Learning Lab. Thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
We are here to talk about EOPs. That's what we call Emergency Operations Plans. And we are asked you specifically to come in because we here at the Center have reviewed your EOP, and you are doing a lot of good things. And we wanted you to come in and share the EOP process with other districts, and so that they can get some nuggets on how to improve on their EOP processes and how they operationalize that throughout the school year and how they update that. So before we get started, please tell us a little bit about yourself and the district that you work in.
Okay, my name's Ty Morrow, and I'm the Director of Safety, Security, and Emergency Management for Brazosport Independent School District. The district is a medium-sized district. We have 19 separate campuses. We have 4 support facilities that kind of support those 19 campuses. And we have about 11,500 kids and about 2,000 employees that work in the district.
Okay, so that means it's busy.
Yes.
Y'all got a lot of things going on with that many campuses. We know that EOPs have been mandated since 2005. And after Santa Fe High School in 2018, the Texas School Safety Center was charged to start reviewing those in 2019. So one of the things that we get asked quite often is, who is responsible for developing that EOP? And we know that that is a function of the School Safety and Security Committee,
Correct.
But how that actually operationalizes varies by district. So tell us about how y'all do that at Brazosport ISD.
Well, it's funny you should ask that. It's the larger the district is, the more complex and the more complicated it becomes to, facilitate the developing that EOP. Mm-hmm. So at our district, what we do is each campus administration team is responsible for developing their emergency operation plan for their specific campus.
Okay.
So in essence, that means we've got 19 chiefs or the chiefettes that are developing their plan, but then that plan has to be coordinated and collaborated with the overall district's plan. So basically we got, the district's got its overall plan, and then we've got like 19 campus plans that are, subletted underneath that to include then all the other annexes that go along with that.
And the reason why that's important is because one campus may have one set of hazards that another campus may not, correct?
Absolutely correct.
Can you expound a little bit on what that looks like actually in your district? What's one campus that has a hazard and another campus that has a different one?
Okay, so there are schools that are located in what we call Freeport, Texas, are surrounded by what we call industry.
Okay, yep.
So we've got a lot of chemical plants. We've got a port that are located in those areas that present a unique challenge of, chemical releases, chemical explosions, and all those different kind of things that can happen versus when you get to our outer complexes, which are, say, in Lake Jackson, Richwood, theirs is more a hazard from, like active shooter, weather events. So we've got to make sure we've got, different plans for one campus versus the other, but they all have to be incorporated in the district's overall plan.
And the reason why that's important is because all of the district people who are also charged to respond need to know what's going on in every single campus.
Absolutely correct.
Okay. So one of the things that kind of touches on is that hazard analysis. You've got to look where you are geographically and what your student makeup is. So tell us a little bit about how you train all of those campuses, chiefs or chiefettes, as you called them, so that they know what to look for. And let's be honest, they're on those campuses every single day. Right. So they know exactly their community. Right. But how do you facilitate that from a district level for all of those different campus administrators, also knowing what we're dealing with right now is high campus turnover for the administration?
Well, one of the ways that I instituted once I took over the office with the approval of Mr. Massey, who's the superintendent, is at the beginning of the school year when we have our pre-trainings prior to the students coming back, is we have a day that's called, everything safety.
Okay, so it's the whole day.
Correct. And, myself and Mr. Whitehead, who's my boss, who's the Assistant Superintendent of Administrative Services, Chief Wade Nichols, who's in charge of the police department, Molly James, who's our Director of Nurses, Dr. Robin Pelton, who's the Director of Student Services. We all come together with the principals, and we have them, for a full day, and we talk about everything medical and safety to make sure they begin to identify, okay, what are the hazards that you have in your environment? And then how do you begin to plan for that? And then, how can we at the district central office level come in and kind of support you to facilitate that?
And when you said PD, does this mean that you have your own police department, or do y'all contract out?
No, we have our own police department.
Okay.
We got 21 officers, and we also have a security specialist. So we have right now 18 security specialists that are at our secondary campuses. So we got law enforcement officers that are there for law enforcement issues,
Okay.
basically shoot the shooter if they show up on campus. And then we've got 18 safety specialists whose sole role is to walk the halls, check the bathrooms, check the common areas, check the doors, and make sure everything is safe.
Is that at every campus or just your second? Is that what you said, secondary?
At secondary.
Okay.
So from intermediates up.
Okay, and so that's fifth grade and up?
Correct.
Okay. And so y'all, at the beginning of the year, you have your professional development.
Correct.
For that, you're developing that. And then I'm assuming you're also checking to ensure that they also know what are the preventative measures that y'all do. But then also, just as important, what is the response going to look like?
Absolutely.
Do y'all talk with just the principal, or is it the principal and the assistant principals in their team?
No, it's the principals and assistant principals, and then once they go back to from the professional development day, then myself, Chief Wade, Robin, Jay go out to their campuses, and then we talk to their crisis teams, their threat assessment teams, to make sure everybody's on the same page. One, identifying what the threats are, their hazards for their particular campus, and then also looking at from the perspective on the personal side. Where are the students that we know we have challenges with, that we have to have extra support in place for them as we begin to roll through the school year to make sure they're, on track to stay off, we call the pathway to violence.
Correct. So let's talk about the school year. We all know things happen during the school year. It can be anything from a student bringing a knife to school to a bus accident to a storm
Correct.
coming and blowing off a roof. So we know that we prepare for those, we train for those, we have our drills, but then things do occur every day on our school campuses. One of the things that we have heard is the importance of that after-action review.
Oh.
What went right, but more importantly, let's be honest, what didn't go? What did we think was going to happen, and what did not happen? And so my question to you is, do y'all do after-action reviews, and what have y'all learned from them?
Okay, if I can kind of give you an example. So 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, we had a false active shooter that came in. And the information was that there was an active shooter at CIS, which stands for Clute Intermediate School.
Okay.
And with that being said, again, communications is always the major issue in any of these type of events, doesn't matter what the hazard is. So we responded as if it was an actual event. Okay. So the chief of police responded, I responded, and luckily we had in place a process with all our local jurisdictions where we had given them what's called an emergency response plan.
Okay.
And in that plan, it had basically diagrammed the entire school visually to include the maps of the entire area, maps of the interior of the complex, for where each room was, room numbers. And we had functionally taken our law enforcement and fire partners on us when we did our drills, our lockdown drills during the year.
So they had been included this whole time?
The whole time. So when this event unfolded, as it did, and everybody responded as if it was an active shooter, and the outer perimeter, as we say, already had outlined from lessons we learned from Santa Fe and other shootings that we studied across America. So all the law enforcement folks know that the primary team was already in the building.
Okay.
To begin to identify where is the threat. So all the secondary folks that showed up knew exactly where they needed to go
Okay.
to stage and then be given assignments. The fire folks knew where they needed to show up to stage for triage just in case we had, individuals that were injured. Life Flight had already been notified, and they already knew because of the maps and things we had already put in place where their landing zones were going to be if they were activated and had to come. Mm-hmm. So when everybody showed up, the outer perimeter showed up and did exactly what they needed to do. They secured it, kept the roadways open just in case, we need to get vehicular traffic in. And then we had the ability for the team on the inside to be able to, okay, this isn't an active shooter.
False alarm.
Yeah, that was a false alarm, so we were able to back away from that. But the lessons we learned from that is the plan that we had in place worked because everybody knew it. But the lesson we did learn was that the reunification process that we had set in place was a dismal, failure. It did not go because of the proximity, the way things were set up. So we learned from that we had to kind of readjust, and we went back and kind of went to the drawing board to look at that because the way our district is so large, we had 3 separate reunification areas depending on the feeder pattern for that school. And we said, well, that makes no sense. We need to have one because it's hard to remember 3 different plans.
Right.
So from that after-action review, we're able to go back through and have a conversation with the district team, say, hey, we need to reevaluate this. So that was one lesson learned. The other lesson learned on the inside, the principals who were responsible for managing that crisis on their end, they learned that they didn't follow their plan.
Okay.
They learned that, we did some things like, I think one principal said, I couldn't hear it, so I stepped out to look.
That's not the plan.
Yeah, that's not the plan.
Right.
So, but by having those candid conversations, with the principals, with everybody that was involved in this, to include our outside partners, we made some adjustments and then went back and, redid the plan and then retrained everybody on, okay, now if this happens again,
right,
this is the next steps or how we need to do that.
That is a great example, but I want to also ask you about something because what you just said sounds really great, like it's in this perfect package, right? But one of the things that you mentioned was that all of these different entities, you mentioned fire,
correct,
you mentioned Life Flight,
correct,
you mentioned, I believe, EMS,
correct,
they had all already gotten that information, meaning that y'all had already worked with them before,
yes,
and
ma'am.
They knew. So that takes a lot of time and effort.
Yes.
I mean, I think that's one thing that we also want people to understand is this is not something that you're going to do in a month.
No.
And so can you talk, just because we all want to make sure that we're all prepared on the day
correct,
something happens. But the success of what that looks like really pertains to all of the work we did before.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you to just backtrack just a little bit.
Yes, ma'am.
And you said we prepared plans,
right, and
we shared that with them. You didn't just send them an email and say, here's our plans.
No.
So can you expound just a little bit on that of what did that look like? I mean, what are we talking about, 3 months? Because they now know every single school. You have 19 schools.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit about your process to ensure, because that's part of the EOP.
Yes, ma'am.
Right? It's part of the EOP that all of the people that are going to come are aware. But I know that's where districts struggle.
Yes.
Because you also have to make outreach.
Correct.
And invite them. So tell us a little bit about your process for doing that, because that I think is very key.
Correct. The process started before I actually got into the role that I am in now. So that would have probably been, right after the Santa Fe shooting happened. Our districts, Jay Whitehead, Chief Wade Nichols, Robin Pelton, whose 3 were responsible for our EOP and emergency operations planning, began that outreach. And when I got hired for the job, I was the chief of police in Freeport. So I had connectivity to a lot greater reach than they did. So once I got in, I just started reaching out to all my partners, all the folks that I have developed relationship with, over the years, and saying, hey, look, our safety, the kids' safety, the student safety, the community safety is highly dependent on everybody being engaged. Everybody has a piece in this, even though the district owns it. We need your help.
Absolutely.
So we began having conversations with them about, hey, we need to develop our EOP. We need to develop our ERP, which is our emergency response plan, so everybody knows what their role are. So everybody knows where their responsibilities lie, and we can identify pre-event all the things that we need to have in place for the event moving forward. And that requires lots of communication, lots of meetings, and it doesn't happen overnight. And it was where we're at now is a 3-year process.
Okay, yeah.
To get to, where I think, I pray to God, knock on wood, that we never have an event. And then when we do have an event, the plan we have, is probably going to go out the window. You're just going to manage it the best you can at that time until you can get that chaos.
Well, that's why you plan.
Right.
That's why you plan. That's why you have that plan.
So you have to have that in place. And I can to further that, they did that process before I got there, right after Santa Fe, which was, I think, 2018.
Yes, sir.
And for 3 years, I have been building up to where we have a mass, real-life, active event with role players. So, in the first part of that was doing a tabletop.
Yes.
So, on the 25th of October of this year, I was finally able to pull a mass tabletop where we brought everybody in the region into a room to begin to look at what would it look like if we had a mass casualty event.
And I'm assuming that also took a lot of planning and coordination.
It took a lot, and it took help from Texas Department of Emergency Management under Governor Abbott's shop. Our regional rep from there. We had to have Homeland Security under Colonel, I think it's McGraw. He's DP from the DPS. He's got a Homeland Security arm. They came in and helped us facilitate it. And then we brought everybody from Memorial Hermann, Lifelight, PHI, our NGOs, non-governmental organizations, the Red Cross, Salvation Army.
They don't just, they don't just show up on the day of the event.
Exactly.
They have to know where they're going and what the plan is.
Right. We brought the Port of Freeport. We brought, all the other part and every hospital in the region.
Ah, good point. Yep.
Was there to have this conversation about vulnerabilities, gaps, and how they're going to triage and which one's going to take, which patients if they came in. We had all the fire, EMS, law enforcement. We even had the industry partners because they've got their own fire departments, their own paramedics, their own local law enforcement that secure the facilities, and everybody was in a room to cut it up, say, hey, if this happens, these are things that we can bring to the table.
So you used an interesting term, and you said to cut it up, but that basically means to cut it up and look.
Correct.
But then also to say, hey, this isn't going to work.
Correct.
That takes also, there's two things I think that we, and it's something you also mentioned about with the principals. We also have to have a level of vulnerability to be able to say, we don't know and we need your help.
Correct.
But also from the principals and the assistant principals, when we have those after action reviews, we have to get everybody to be able to say, here's what went right and here's what didn't. So how do you create that safe place for those principals and those, because we all know they're the ones that are on the scene when it happens, right? Until we can get there.
Right.
And so how do y'all create that culture of awareness and teamwork? It sounds like a lot of teamwork, a lot of organizational planning, but also you have to have that level of vulnerability for people to be able to take criticism of a plan, to give criticism of a plan, but then also to be able to say, I still don't get it.
That is, again, been a long process because I'm not from the education field. My has been in law enforcement, public safety, security. And what I found in education is educators, they own, particularly the principals and assistant principals, they own their campus.
Absolutely.
And most superintendents try to keep their hands off from, dictating, how they run it.
Right.
So my role is to let them know that, hey, I am not here to criticize or to point fingers. I am here to help and support. And the only way that we can make sure that your staff, our students, your students are safe is, we have to be able to identify our gaps.
Yep.
And we have to be open, we have to be honest, and we have to be transparent about what that looks like. And then when you have a lesson that's learned, you have to be able and willing to share that information with your other 18 other chiefs and chiefettes so they don't have to make the same issues or mistakes that you made.
Absolutely.
And that was clearly evident because after we had the false event at Clute Intermediate and we were able to identify, okay, how did that information go from it's not us, it's someplace not even in our state that is having this actual event.
Oh, wow.
How did that get transferred into it's happening here? And then how did we ring the bell that we can't unrung to get there? So what we did was we did an after action internally with that core group. And then once it was done with Mr. Massey's, the superintendent's permission, we took that core group and we parked it at a principal's meeting.
Nice.
And then we took that core group and we parked them at an assistant principal's meeting. And then we walked through everything that went right, everything that, had areas for improvements. And then we walked them through, okay, and here's where we move forward.
So moving forward, you're in charge of the EOP, and the EOP is a living document. Does that mean that you then go back at some point, somebody's got to go back and update the EOP, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And so that's happening throughout the year anytime there's an after action review.
Correct.
Okay.
Anytime there's an after action review, I think we've had this year so far, I think we've had 3 different events where we had to go back and look at our, EOPs for the campus to make some adjustments. Because we had one was we had an AC issue that went to a total. They were fixing the AC. The company that came in, they zapped the entire power.
Yeah,
so
we're done.
We lost the whole building for the day.
Right.
So part of their EOP for that campus was the reunification piece. And when we went to support and we got there, it's like, oh my God, this is not going like it's supposed to. So we had to make some adjustments.
And I think that's a really interesting part. A lot of people think, well, first of all, reunification is not mandated in law, but we all know it's a best practice because you're going to need it. You may not need it for an active shooter event, but this is perfect where you lose electricity. And so one of the things that we have always heard is practice your reunification because you will find so many holes so that when you actually do need it, and that's not part of that training and drilling, but even if you can't get around to practicing it, if you have that live event. So what was one of the things that you learned, for example, when you had to do that with the electricity going out? 1 or 5, however many you want to share with us.
Well, we'll just give you a couple. So one of the issues was on the unification, you're supposed to have your checker.
Yep.
So the checker that comes in, they're supposed to get the information from the parent. They're supposed to take their identification, and then they're supposed to give it to the accountant who's supposed to look at it and verify against your teams or whatever your data system is to make sure that that information is correct and that individual can pick up that kid.
That's right.
And then you're supposed to have your runner that's supposed to be able to then go let somebody know that, hey, that parent's here to get the person. Right. And then you reunify them and send them on their way.
Sounds easy.
It sounds easy. We got there and there were like 300 parents lined up down the sidewalk.
And they all wanted their kid
And they
now.
all wanted their kid right now.
Right.
And the folks up front were doing what they had been trained from the safety side. They were checking everybody into Raptor.
Oh.
So you had one individual with one computer trying to check everybody's ID to then give to the checker, then give to the accountant, then give to the runner, then to get the kid and bring them back. Even though their plan had it laid out, you have the checker, you have the accountant, you've got the reunifier, but you've got an alpha split set up where you got tables where you can do that. They hadn't done that.
Wow.
So that was
makes a big difference.
That makes a big
One
difference.
at a time versus 10 at a time.
Correct. So we're able to, help them work through that, rectify that. So now we've had 2 events where 2 campuses that did the exact same thing that this campus was doing. So now we're going back through, me personally, and we're meeting with every single campus, every 19 of them, and retraining them.
There you go.
In a reunification process, campus by campus, crisis team by crisis team, with all their staff say, hey, this is what it looks like.
Well, and that I think is important also is when we notice once or multiple times, they're not getting it.
Correct.
And not because they're not wanting to not get it, but because it's on the long list of everything that educators are doing. So that's key, because what you said is, I'm going, you, Mr. Morrow, are going personally, and you're retraining all of the staff.
Correct.
And that takes time too.
Yes.
I mean, that I think is probably, would you say that's the biggest takeaway from developing an EOP is it takes time?
It takes time. Yes, it does.
And it's not just 2 days.
No.
It's never ending.
It's not.
Right?
I think I have job security for a while, unless I really mess something up. And whoever's in that role has to be able to, do that analysis on a consistent basis by being out there, observing, and then helping folks correct to make sure we've got a viable plan.
Because they also won't know if they're not doing it properly if they don't know.
Correct.
Because we plan, that actually makes total sense. Oh, we're going to have the Raptor, we're going to do this. It works in the school every single day.
Right.
So if you think about it, but in a high emotional time, one at a time isn't going to work.
No. And I don't fault the administrators on the campus.
No, there's no way they could know that.
Right. And I think, and the reason why I think, our district is different than I think Blast is, Mr. Massey recognized that educators are great at educating. Mm-hmm. They're not so much good at safety, security, and emergency management because that's not their background.
Yep.
That's not the world they work in or, truly understand. I mean, some can adapt to that. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes you have to have the availability, having, fresh eyes on the outside come into an educational institution that can then help mold the institution to have a good safety, security, and emergency management plan without it looking like a fortress or sending everybody into, hypersensitive mode that, something bad's going to happen every day.
Right.
There's got to be a balance with that. And I think, one of the things that I'm glad the, Texas School Safety Center did was, develop the registry that can begin to help those districts, particularly the smaller ones or the larger ones,
sure,
identify what we call the subject matter experts in those areas that can help them, develop their EOPs. Mm-hmm. But the balance that you have to have is that EOP still belongs to the district. It doesn't belong to the consultant or whoever you bring in. It's got to take into account the climate, the culture of that organization, and blend that into the EOP with all the hazards that they may exist so they have a viable plan.
And drill.
Yes, and drill.
And I think that is one of the ways that educators are learning to become very knowledgeable in safety in today's world. They're learning that this is how we can operate to ensure that we're keeping safety as that priority as we educate students every single day. What advice would you give a new safety director? I'm going to ask you for two different people.
Okay.
A new safety director, so new to the job, hey, we got to turn in an EOP to the Texas School Safety Center. Where do I start? That's a luxury here in Texas to have a safety director.
Yes,
we're over 65% rural, I believe. So, we have a lot of districts who don't have the luxury of a safety director. So, what is your advice to someone who has a safety director? What are some of the first steps that they should focus on? Is it the same as someone who doesn't have a safety director, or is it different?
That's a unique question. I'm just trying to characterize that. I think either with a safety director or without, I think the first thing they would need to do, whoever's in that role, is to, depending on the size of the organization, go talk to every single principal and say, from your perspective, what are the safety, security, and emergency management issues that you see on your campus? Mm-hmm. And then what is it that, I or we, being central office, can do to help support you and to make sure you have all the things you need in place?
It's the standard, don't make assumptions on what they need, just ask them.
Just ask them.
They'll tell you.
Oh, yeah. And I'll tell you a lot and be ready to write.
Exactly.
And recognize that, and when you're having those conversations with those individuals, I always start as, hey, what's going right?
Right.
Where do we have areas of improvement? And if you were king or queen for the day and there was unlimited budgets and you could do anything, what is the number 1, 2, and 3 thing that you would identify as being issues for your campus?
Well, I think that's really important because we have to understand and value that role of campus leadership.
Correct.
That's who the teachers take orders from. That's who they listen to. That's their charge, right? And we all know that every campus looks just like their campus leader,
Correct.
right?
Absolutely.
And so, I think that is, whether you have a safety director or not,
Correct.
that's probably the number one thing. It's something we train for in your audits,
Yes.
but we also know because audits are only mandated once a year, a lot of times that's the only time that they're getting asked those questions. Right. And so I think that's a really nice complement of really talking to campus administrators and campus teams. And let's not forget those head custodians.
That is right. Oh, absolutely.
Because those can be your best allies.
Yes.
They know exactly what's going on.
Absolutely.
And a lot of times they've been there longer than even your campus administrators. So they are the ones also that can let you know what the current challenges are,
Correct.
What's worked in the past, what hasn't worked in the past.
Correct.
What is something that you feel that Brazosport ISD is doing that you wish every school district had the ability to do?
Wow. I had to think on that one for a minute.
Of course.
I would say if funding is not a question or an issue, the one thing I would strongly suggest is that they hire or make one person to be in charge of safety, security, and emergency management, and to ensure that that individual's role or job is nothing but looking at safety, security, and emergency management every single day.
Okay. Supporting the campuses.
Supporting the campuses. And by doing so, because the principals are busy, they're just like really, really, really busy with administrative and educational things. But if they have somebody that, even if it's at the district central office level, that individual has the ability then to get around the campus and be able to be the eyes and ears
Right.
for the district to be able to identify gaps. So I think if there was one thing, I would say that have one person
In charge.
of managing all of that. Now, it's got to be supported by those, at least for us,
Right.
by 19 other individuals behind the scenes for their specific campus. But by doing that, then you've got one person that can keep their eye on the ball all times.
Very good. Well, those are all the questions that I have. Do you have anything else that you want to add, to other safety directors or superintendents that are listening to this podcast and, are thinking, where do we start? How do we implement? We know now because they're mandated in Texas, all districts have an EOP.
Correct.
So I do want to say, if you're new and you can't find your EOP, go to your school safety committee.
Correct.
Or contact us at the Texas School Safety Center because you've sent it in to us for us to check. So,
Right.
So we have a copy of that as well. But what advice do you have for them?
Well, a couple of things I would have in advice. One is I say, go on the Texas School Safety Center website and look at the toolkit, and everything that they need to develop their EOP is there. It's already, set for
Right.
them. It's set up for them. Then all they have to do is do the work to identify, the hazard and things that needs to be in that EOP. And then they need to get out and communicate and engage the stakeholders in a conversation to put that EOP together, knowing that it's not going to be done overnight. And, what I like to say is start with your high probability things where either property is going to be lost or lives are going to be lost, but it's a very low occurrence. I would start with that first to get their EOP started. So active shooter, if you're in a chemical area, working on chemical,
Look
response.
at your hazards.
Look at your hazards and develop that plan. And if you got the overall master plan for the worst that can happen on the worst possible day and got that developed, everything else is going to fall into place.
Right.
Because then you just got to plug the pieces.
And then train,
and drill them. The other piece I would say, I know, Governor Abbott is releasing a lot of funding for that, but most of the industry educators are missing the point. There are a lot of grants out there.
Okay.
On the federal side, under COPS and under SVVP, Stop School Violence, prevention programs, that a lot of school districts are not putting in for.
Okay.
Which is not, I won't say free money, but for the safety, security of the students and the staff, if they've got somebody keeping their eye on the ball, you can go after those grants,
right,
which will give you additional funding to help fill the gaps on some of the safety needs that may be existing within your organization. And a lot of them say, well, I don't have time, I don't have an expert, I don't know how to do it. There is a cadre of folks, that I know personally that, the key is, hey, they're grant writers.
There you go.
They do this every day, all day. They know the answers. They know the questions that the government's looking for. They know the players. And the beauty of them, if you find the right one, you don't pay them. They get paid if you get the grant.
Right.
If you don't get the grant, you don't owe them anything. But you have to develop that relationship with that grant writer ahead of time before the grant comes out. So they have a viability or relationship with you and saying, hey, I know Ty's going to do me right. He's going to give me the information in a timely manner that I need to put in for this grant, which then gives me the likelihood more that they're going to get the grant. I'm going to get paid versus, some guy that just calls me up out of the blue or gal that calls me up out of the blue and say, hey, I want to go after this grant. And then they say, well, I need this information. And when they call and say they need it, they need it.
Right.
That needs to become a priority to get them the information. And we've been very, very, very successful in using that model.
Good.
That I just was talking about that a lot of school districts don't know about. And we've been able to get almost a little bit over $1 million.
That's wonderful.
To facilitate that.
Well, I'm going to conclude with one of the things that I feel has been the theme of our discussion is relationships.
Yes, ma'am.
It's the relationships with the responders that are going to respond. You've mentioned your leadership, the relationship with your superintendent to allow you to do the work that needs to be done, the time, your board, the relationships with your campus leaders.
Great.
Those are very important. They've got to be able to trust you, that you're going to listen. And then your relationship with your other directors, because you're not doing this alone.
Oh, no,
you mentioned health, you mentioned transportation, you're mentioning all of these other people. And so, I think a lot of times when people think about EOPs, they just think of, it's this document we've got to put together. But it's not something you just put together overnight. It's a living document. Right. And the only way it can work is through relationships and building and communicating, being vulnerable and being willing to address the needs.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being vulnerable with us.
Yes, ma'am.
And letting us know where you all have also struggled, but also where you've also succeeded. And we look forward to seeing more things that are going on in Brazosport ISD. And we hope you'll be presenting at our conference this June and sharing that in person with some other districts.
Oh, well, we will be thrilled and honored if you would have us to present.
We would, because I know we're going to have a lot of people that are listening to this, and they're probably going to want to meet you and hear firsthand on what you're doing and continue to build relationships.
Yes,
so thank you so much for coming to the Learning Lab. We appreciate it.
Thank you.